I'm Howard Husick, Vice President for Policy Research here at the Manhattan Institute and Director of the Institute's Social Entrepreneurship and Civil Society Initiative. It's my great pleasure to introduce to deliver this year's William E. Simon Lecture on Philanthropy and Social Entrepreneurship, Michael Gerson. Before I introduce our speaker, let me note that the Simon Lecture is part of the Institute's overall work in the social entrepreneurship and civil society area. It includes our annual award program for outstanding, innovative civil society initiatives, that means non-governmental, that serve those in need, the Simon Prize for lifetime achievement in social entrepreneurship, and research and writing related to the relationship among philanthropy, civil society, and the government. The initiative is made possible by the generous primary support of the William E. Simon Foundation. As contemporary conservatives ponder what constitutes not just a potential electoral strategy, but the fundamentals of a governing strategy, few voices will be more important than that of our speaker this evening, Michael Gerson. Indeed, because his interest and passion in that area is so fundamental, his topics range incredibly widely, as anyone who follows his column for the Washington Post can attest. His scrutiny of late has been directed to the structure of the American welfare system, the immigration system, as well as to the question of what should inform our efforts toward the poor well beyond our borders. In other words, the former chief speechwriter for President George W. Bush ranges very widely and daringly, as in his essay in the current issue of National Affairs with Peter Wehner entitled, "A Government We Can Be Proud of." In that essay, notably for our purposes this evening, he's thoughtful and imaginative, both in discussing what he views as the legitimate roles of government and on the crucial importance of American civil society, our institutions outside of government. Citizens are cultivated, he writes, by institutions, families, religious communities, neighborhoods, nations, parents and spouses, churches and synagogues, teachers and coaches. The Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts are among the foremost shapers of citizens in our republic. He has long been mindful as well of the crucial role of non-governmental institutions in dealing with groups about which he has long expressed concern, as in his 2007 book, Heroic Conservatism. Conservatives, he wrote, cannot ignore the poor, the addicted, the children at risk. Who better, in other words, than someone with the breadth of interests of Michael Gerson, coupled with his concern for what constitutes a robust and attractive contemporary conservatism, to reflect on our question for the evening: what is conservative philanthropy? Who better than someone who has thought so hard about the proper role and limits of government to discuss that which should remain outside of government? Is conservative philanthropy distinguished, for instance, by its causes, its methods, or by both? Should it seek to be a model or a pilot for government, or are there needs which will always be better addressed privately, with private support? These are the sorts of questions which Michael Gerson will consider this evening, just as he has considered them for the Washington Post and as he considered them during his time in the White House. He's currently an op-ed columnist for the Washington Post from 2001 until 2006. He served as chief speechwriter and senior policy advisor for President George W. Bush. He's the author of Heroic Conservatism, co-author of City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era. He serves as senior advisor at ONE, a bipartisan organization dedicated to the fight against extreme poverty and preventable diseases. He's on the board of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council, board of directors of Bread for the World, the Initiative for Global Development Leadership Council. From 2006 to 2009, he was the Roger Hertog Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Prior to his service in the White House, he served as speechwriter both for Senator Robert Dole and Representative Jack Kemp. Please join me in welcoming Michael Gerson.
Thank you so much for the kind words, and it's always great to be with a think tank crowd since the expectations of entertainment are not too high. It reminds me of a conversation I had with my two sons during the heat of the presidential election of 2004. My little boy, Nicholas, who was then 6 years old, announced to me in the car that he wanted John Kerry for president. When I asked him why, he said, "So you can be home on weekends." My 9-year-old, who was a little more practical, then said, "But how would we eat?" I told him, I think I could get a job, I might go to a think tank, and he said, "Of course, what's a think tank?" So I told him, well, it's people who read and speak and have meetings and things. And Bucky, and this is true, said, "You mean they don't do anything?" The Manhattan Institute is a think tank that does things. The scholars here think more about governing than any other institution on the right, about government not just as an abstract idea, but as a set of institutions with management responsibilities on behalf of a community. And it is very different from the vague ideological debates we often have in Washington. So let me start by thanking the Manhattan Institute for making the defense of markets and liberty as real and practical as possible. My topic tonight is the meaning and future of conservative philanthropy, and the issue is very much in the news. The majority leader of the United States Senate, Harry Reid, recently took to the floor to denounce the Koch brothers for trying to buy America and having no conscience and being as un-American as anyone I can imagine. The very idea of a powerful public official attacking private citizens for exercising their constitutional rights is just about as un-American as I can imagine. It is always a sign of intellectual bankruptcy when politicians, instead of disputing ideas, try to discredit the funders of ideas. The idea that every conservative political success is really purchased by malevolent conservative billionaires is a consistent theme of liberal conspiracy theories and the subject of many thick studies attacking conservative philanthropy. But when you look through them, the criticisms often read more like envy. Political liberals think the influence of conservative foundations is so evil, so sinister, that they want to duplicate it. In fact, over the last several decades, conservative philanthropy has been dramatically successful at setting the terms of the national debate with a fraction of the funding of their more liberal counterparts. This influence has not been sinister. But I will argue tonight that it is fading in some important ways as conservative giving has become less strategic and more narrowly political. I don't make this argument as an academic expert, though it's made by experts I trust. I approach this issue from a different background, as a practitioner at the crossroads of ideology, policy, and politics. So let me begin with a little intellectual autobiography to set the stage. It can be a daunting project to imagine our younger selves. I came to Washington with a degree in theology from Wheaton College in Illinois and an excess of earnestness. As some of you may know, Wheaton is a pretty morally conservative place. When I went there, the joke on campus was that the administration had banned premarital sex because it might lead to dancing. But there is another part of the evangelical heritage that gets less attention. The founder of Wheaton was also a strong abolitionist, dedicated to the rights and education of African Americans and women. 19th century Northern evangelicalism had a highly developed sense of social justice, which Wheaton passes along to this day. Arriving on Capitol Hill, I found myself looking for models of social engagement. Conservative Protestantism was energetic, but intellectually thin. Like many others, I turned to Catholic social teaching, mediated to me through writers such as Michael Novak. I found a rich tradition urging solidarity with the poor, but placing primary emphasis on the health of families and civic institutions. I also found that most Catholics knew nothing about Catholic social thought. During Governor Al Smith's presidential campaign in 1928, when he was accused of undue fidelity to the teachings of the Catholic Church, he is reputed to have responded, "What the hell is an encyclical?" There are a lot of Al Smith Catholics in Washington, but Catholic social thought remains the most developed, compelling intellectual alternative to libertarianism in the Republican coalition. I also encountered a number of neoconservative thinkers. Irving and B. Crystal, James Q. Wilson, the early Daniel Patrick Moynihan. While making peace with some of the goals of the New Deal and Great Society, they offered a comprehensive critique of the spirit of progressivism. Against the arrogance of planners, they affirmed the importance of bourgeois values in traditional communities, and they gave 2 cheers for capitalism, believing the system was in danger of being severed from its moral moorings. I remember one very New York story, visiting Norman Podhoretz here in Manhattan for breakfast. Halfway through the conversation, after bagels and a lot of agreement, he started asking questions about my background. When I finally told him that my grandfather was actually Jewish, he said in a voice that was loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear, "I knew it." Come to think of it, this constellation of intellectual heroes, William Wilberforce, Pope John the 23rd, and Irving Kristol, is really some kind of libertarian nightmare. But these influences left me attracted to a certain kind of Republican. I worked as a policy director and speechwriter for Senator Dan Coats of Indiana, where I helped shape a package of legislation called the Project for American Renewal, designed to catalyze the work of private and faith-based charities in solving social problems. I worked for Jack Kemp, who remains a model and an inspiration, even though he was so irrepressibly spontaneous that he never actually delivered a speech I wrote for him. And for 7 eventful years, I worked for Governor, then President George W. Bush, who ran and won as a compassionate conservative. Bush, in fact, was not always compassionate. He could be pretty sharp-tongued. Every year, I remember, on the day of the State of the Union address, the president would sit down with all of the network anchors for a time of question and answer. At one of those sessions, the late Peter Jennings asked him, "What does it feel like to go before the nation and read someone else's words?" The president immediately replied, "You do it every night." But George W. Bush did set a purposely inclusive political tone. In his first policy speech of the 2000 campaign, he declared, quote, "I know that the reputation of our government has been tainted by scandal and cynicism, but the American government is not the enemy of the American people. At times it is wasteful and grasping, but we must correct it, not disdain it. Government must be carefully limited, but strong and active and respected within those bounds. It must act in the common good, and that good is not common until it is shared by those in need. In this campaign," he went on, "I will bring a message to my own party. We must apply our conservative and free market ideas to the job of helping real human beings, because any ideology, no matter how right in theory, is sterile and empty without that goal. There must be a kindness in our justice. There must be a mercy in our judgment. There must be a love behind our zeal." End quote. It's one of the nice things about being a former speechwriter. You can quote the President of the United States and actually be quoting yourself. These ideas had their ups and downs in the Republican Party, but they eternally recur under different names, and the reason is rather simple. Most people engage in our political life to improve the lives of their neighbors. I honestly believed then, and still believe, that conservative and free market ideas, properly and creatively applied, can help real human beings. And I believe that politics is an important and honorable calling precisely because its stakes are so high. It matters greatly whether people live in freedom or tyranny, whether their neighborhoods are orderly or occupied by gangs, whether schools inspire children or routinely betray them. Seriousness about these alternatives leads to an unavoidable impulse of social justice, a moral conviction that the whole community is diminished when any are unfairly or arbitrarily excluded from its promise. In his essay, "When Virtue Loses All Her Loveliness," Irving Kristol argued, in the same way as men cannot for long tolerate a sense of spiritual meaninglessness in their individual lives, so they cannot for long accept a society in which power, privilege, and property are not distributed according to some morally meaningful criteria. This impulse, of course, can be sloppy, utopian, or counterproductive, but it will not be erased. I remember teaching a group of Princeton students along with Professor Robbie George. Young libertarian came up to us afterwards, questioning the whole enterprise of social justice. Robbie responded that every significant tradition of Christian social ethics in history has included the concept of distributive justice, the idea that human beings deserve some basic things in life just because they are human beings. This is a defining contribution of religion to Western culture and politics, and it will outlast any ideology that denies it. Dismounting the pulpit for a moment, I also believe that a commitment to the common good is a political necessity, particularly in national elections. I was a very junior speechwriter in Bob Dole's 1996 campaign, in which the candidate's entire domestic policy consisted of a worn copy of the 10th Amendment he would take out of his pocket and wave around during rallies. Dole was campaigning for president on a procedure. In the 2000 elections, Bush campaigned on certain outcomes: improving inner-city schools, providing educational options for parents, encouraging faith-based drug treatment. Americans, in my view, want a president with a governing vision that includes the interests of people who are unlikely to vote for them. It signals their belief that we are part of a single nation of justice and opportunity. Creative policy meets public needs, but it also signals the values of a candidate and a party. Looking back, I now realize that behind the conservative intellectual trends that shaped my thinking as a young activist in the 1980s and 90s was a certain vision of philanthropy, practiced most strategically by the Olin and Bradley foundations, but also by others. They made investments in the creation of an intellectual milieu, something with benefits difficult to quantify on a grant proposal. They often gave multi-year gifts supporting general operating costs to projects and institutions that set out to change the political culture. This kind of giving had a clear, unifying public purpose: the return of citizenship and self-government by promoting the civilizing work of family and civil society. And this form of giving had a method to create a conveyor belt from theory to political practice. The kind of conveyor belt I'm talking about can be seen on a number of issues. On welfare, there was Charles Murray's Losing Ground and the Bradley Foundation's Working Seminar on Family and American Welfare Policy, and the Wisconsin reforms in the 1990s, and a Democratic candidate for president pledging to end welfare as we know it, and then passage of a dramatically successful national welfare reform. On promoting the work of faith-based institutions, which I was very interested in, there was a slim book of lasting influence, To Empower People, by Peter Berger and Richard John Newhouse, and the work of John DiIulio and Bob Woodson and Steve Goldsmith, and the National Commission on Philanthropy and Civic Renewal, and charitable choice legislation, and the faith-based agenda of the Bush years. The Bush policy speech I mentioned earlier was given at a program in Indianapolis, the Front Porch Alliance, supported by the Bradley Foundation. You could trace a similar progression on other issues, enterprise zones, or the broken windows theories of law enforcement, or educational choice. Many of these efforts involve policy intellectuals with a knack for promoting their work, an infrastructure of think tanks, journals, and commissions, and the cultivation of unexpected alliances with the victims of bureaucratic failure. And all these efforts swam in a sea created by philanthropic dollars. There are many forms of conservative philanthropy and giving, and I don't want to be dismissive tonight of any of them. There's upstream philanthropy that invests in the realm of academic ideas. This was the main focus of early conservative giving, to encourage the revival of classical liberalism in economics and avoid the road to serfdom. There is also downstream philanthropy, focused on fighting and winning current political battles on issues such as Obamacare. But my purpose is to argue for a revival of midstream philanthropy, the translation of ideology and policy into a compelling governing vision. And this also happens to be the greatest current need of the Republican Party, that flawed, fallible institution where conservative ideas find most of their influence. When it comes to ideology in American politics, I think the seesaw is broken. President Obama's version of governing liberalism, centralization, mandates, regulation, is failing before our eyes. The Affordable Care Act is being overwhelmed by unintended consequences and is only kept afloat by exemptions and delays in its provisions. A president who trusts in government has reduced the trust of Americans in government to historical lows. But at the same time, perceptions of the Republican alternative have also bottomed out in the polls. The GOP may well do well in midterm elections where voters skew older and whiter, as they did in 2010. But 2012 demonstrated that generic republicanism could not defeat a weakened incumbent in a national electorate. The problem goes much deeper than a single candidate. The Democratic nominee has won 4 of the last 6 elections, averaging 327 electoral votes to 210 for the GOP nominee. Democrats have exceeded 330 electoral votes on 4 occasions, while the GOP did not exceed 300 electoral votes even once. Modern liberalism is down, and yet trust in the more conservative governing alternative is down as well. The seesaw is broken. There are many reasons for this. Republicans are engaged in a long-term losing fight against demographic change, often alienating rising groups. Some conservative analysts insist that the GOP can still win national elections by maximizing their support among white voters at 65 or 70%, something that has never been achieved before. This, of course, is true. But the political task grows harder and harder over time, as the percentage of minorities in the electorate has been increasing by about 2% every 4 years. And the entire enterprise is disturbing. It means that a political movement has lost confidence in the power of its ideas to appeal to millions of Americans. I recall one story from the time of Governor Pete Wilson in California, who you'll remember ran commercials on immigration with the charming tagline, "They keep coming." A very successful Latino lawyer from California at the time told how his 80-year-old grandmother decided that she wanted to become an American citizen. After the difficult multi-year process, she took the oath with her son at her side. Afterwards, he asked her, "Why did you go to all the trouble?" She replied, "First, because I wanted to be a citizen of the country that has been so good to you. And second, because I wanted to vote against Pete Wilson before I die." Republicans are reaching that point with many Hispanics, and not just with Hispanics. From this perspective, we should not underestimate the disaster of the last presidential election. Mitt Romney is a good, decent, generous, admirable man. But the Republican Party, not long after an epic financial collapse, nominated a venture capitalist who said he is not concerned about the very poor and dismissed 47% of the electorate as a class of citizens who live off the sweat of others, regard themselves as victims, and refuse to accept responsibility. The worst political blows reinforce pre-existing stereotypes, and this one only lacked a top hat and a cigar. But the failure here is even broader. I attended the last Republican convention and listened carefully to many of the speakers. For the most part, their rhetoric assumed that every American is a small business owner, concerned mainly about taxation and regulation. And most Americans, about 90% actually, simply work at a job. Many are concerned about stagnant wages and the flight of blue-collar employment and the decay of working-class neighborhoods. They worry about access to health care and higher education, restoring a semblance of economic opportunity, promoting family commitment, educational attainment, and economic advancement will take tremendous effort and creative policy. Yet Republicans, at their national convention, had very little to say on the largest issues of our time. And some of the populist trends in the GOP are pushing in the opposite direction of a relevant reform-minded conservatism. President Obama's overreach provoked a justified political backlash. But many Tea Party and libertarian populists are focused almost entirely on the defeat of liberalism. They question the constitutionality of much of the modern federal government. They are suspicious of policy alternatives on issues such as health care and critical of the very idea of legislative compromise. They have turned flawed but reasonable attempts at reform, such as Common Core standards, into culture war debates, and they have issued apocalyptic warnings that America is on the verge of tyranny. This sense of urgency, this belief that Obamacare is about to produce a nation of dependents who will forever vote Democratic, has shifted the focus toward the short term. The battle of ideas seems distant and irrelevant. The current political fight is everything. This attitude is reflected across a range of institutions on the right. Some think tanks have aligned themselves with Tea Party advocacy and lost serious policy thinkers in the process. Some foundations have adopted the tools and approaches of political campaigns. Conservative philanthropy, says William Chambra, once helped dispel stereotypes by developing thoughtful private approaches to poverty. Unhappily, it now simply reinforces unfavorable impressions by focusing on short-term political advocacy rather than long-term civic problem solving, end quote. There are, of course, exceptions, probably represented in this room, but the trend is toward a narrow perception of political relevance. This gives conservatives a fight to join without a broadly appealing cause to champion. And this is the great current need for midstream philanthropy to help turn policy and ideology into a compelling story of American life. I will stipulate that some conservative philanthropy is idea-oriented, promoting libertarian or classical liberal ideas. I'm sympathetic to many of them. But this framework is not sufficient for the purposes I'm talking about. The question, what is conservative philanthropy, inevitably leads to the question, what is conservatism? Which I can't answer this evening, but I can give you my simplistic thumbnail Twitter version, which I suppose is the full-time profession of the columnist anyway. Political philosophy can be judged in part by its founders. As Yuval Levin points out, the radical individualism of libertarianism is actually an outgrowth of 18th century radical liberalism, championed by people such as William Godwin and Thomas Paine. They believed that a total liberty would bring prosperity and peace while liberating the individual from oppressive, unchosen social obligations. This stream of thought branched off from modern liberalism as liberalism became more statist, but it has retained the dream of a strictly limited government, rational science, and liberation from ancient prejudices would bring wealth and peace to all. The fundamental conservative insight is very different. Edmund Burke described a complicated, layered arrangement of society held together by trust, respect, love, and compassion for neighbors. This can be threatened, in Burke's phrase, by jerks of authority from above, but it can also be undermined by a radical individualism that tears up the social fabric. The purpose of government, in his view, is to protect and strengthen the web of social relations rather than replace them with abstract notions of liberty. The goal is to sustain and enrich the space for private life. This view will share some policy ground with libertarianism, as the state runs amok and undermines the role and legal standing of private associations. But ultimately, these visions differ on the place of government. The most important, civilizing, compassionate work of a nation takes place between the government and the individual, in families first and foremost, and civil society and religious communities. But government has a positive role in creating a cultural atmosphere in which these institutions can thrive, a public square that is not a seedy carnival, a red light district, or a needle park. And when family structures break down, and private charities are insufficient in scale, and children are vulnerable and victimized, government has a duty, a calling of solidarity and social justice to intervene and help. This is a very different American story, in which private life is primary, but the bonds of community are real. While rejecting the progressive spirit of centralization and bureaucratic arrogance, this form of conservatism actively seeks the common good, and I believe that is a moral and political necessity. This will require a shift in mindset for some in the conservative movement, to view government as a precious, honorable institution that must be reclaimed from its excesses and failures. Filling a gap of governing vision requires more than anti-government rhetoric. It requires a rigorous reform conservatism that makes public institutions, public education, the welfare safety net, entitlement programs, immigration and healthcare systems actually work in the public interest. This is the miscalculation of many conservative populists. Americans, on the whole, do not want public officials who share their contempt for government. They want public officials who no longer justify that contempt. Here's the good news. Over the last year or two, we have seen the beginnings of a governing conservative movement, similar to the creative period of the 1980s and 90s. Think tanks such as the Manhattan Institute, AEI, and the Ethics and Public Policy Center are helping to formulate a policy agenda. A group of reform-minded experts has collected in the orbit of national affairs, the reincarnation of the public interest. And my friend Yuval Levin often sounds like the reincarnation of Irving Kristol. The conveyor belt of ideas has slowly ground into motion once again. And a few impressive conservative politicians have taken up this cause. Senator Mike Lee is articulating a kind of Mormon rugged communitarianism. Marco Rubio has announced creative policies to strengthen the social safety net and increase the rewards of her work. Paul Ryan has set a Kemp-like empowerment agenda within the context of Catholic social thought. The greatest current need, and thus the greatest current opportunity for strategic conservative giving, is to build on this momentum. This means strengthening the network of midstream institutions that translate ideas and policies into themes and stories. It will require the patience to shape our political culture instead of engaging only in immediate political battles. It will involve the creative application of conservative ideas to specific human needs and the cultivation of unexpected ideological alliances. It would benefit from a set of mechanisms for policy experiments at the state level, taking advantage of the fact that 30 Republican governors hold executive power. And it should offer, above all, a superior vision of self-government and social justice. This is what influenced me when I arrived in Washington. This is what will motivate a new generation of young conservatives searching for effective methods to help their neighbors. And one more thing will eventually be required: a presidential nominee who understands the importance of this task, a leader who takes ideas seriously, who is conservative in tone and disposition, who is gracious in bearing, and who tenaciously addresses his message to the entire country. There are a number of historical examples of leaders who have used compelling rhetoric about the importance of civil society: Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. But I want to close with one of my favorites. Government has foundered, he said, as new agencies have proliferated, splitting tasks and energies among dozens of distant and unconnected bureaus. Individuals have lost touch with the institutions of society, even with one another, and thus have become more and more both perpetrators and victims of coldness, cruelty, and violence. It is the destruction, he said, of the sense and often the fact of community, of human dialogue, of the thousand invisible strands of common experience and purpose, affection and respect which tie men to their fellows. It is expressed in words such as community, neighborhood, civic pride, friendship. It provides the life-sustaining force of human warmth, of security among others, and a sense of one's own human significance in the accepted associations and companionship of others. The decay of community has only accelerated since New York Senator Robert F. Kennedy made that case in the 1960s. And modern liberalism, in my view, offers few answers. But I believe that a governing conservatism can at least make the attempt, and in that attempt will be found its success and its soul. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. You spoke a moment ago about the importance of government setting a tone such that neighborhood, community, and civil society can thrive. As new social problems emerge in America, we've become accustomed, I think, as a polity, to thinking that, well, there must be a new program that can emerge, a new federal program often, to address these problems. And yet, as you point out, the best approaches are often those in neighborhood and community. How can, in terms of the dialogue that you're talking about in your remarks, how can candidates or leaders talk to the American people in ways that somehow pierce that expectation that all problems must be addressed through government solutions?
It was Robert Kennedy who also talked about how we have a program for every problem. And he said that in a kind of negative and dismissive way. And of course, the promotion of civic efforts to these civic solutions to these kind of problems is actually a pretty radical form of devolution in the best cases. It's devolution not just to state and local governments, but actually beyond government entirely, to empower families and communities and faith-based organizations. I think, I talked about populism in my speech and was critical of some forms of Tea Party populism, but that actually is a pretty radical form of populism, which talks about the limits of government. And so I think talking in those terms makes, the empowerment of individuals makes a whole lot of sense. I'd only push back in one way. Some of the, John Julio used to make the point that government has often been involved in programs that undermine and weaken civil society. But, and I use the analogy, that when someone has a knife stuck in them, merely removing the knife does not heal the patient. Sometimes the damage can be so significant to family structures or to community structures that it actually requires a more positive effort in order to promote the work of other institutions, the civilizing work of other institutions. And that can be a more activist role. So in inner city Chicago or certain places in New York, where you've had generations now of broken family structures and dysfunctional communities, it may require some creative policy to try to empower those institutions again. Because just removing government won't necessarily solve those problems. I'd also add that one of the areas which I think conservatives are going to need to take seriously is the challenges of social mobility, which some people in this room have talked about. If you read Robert Putnam, and I'm doing an event with him next month up at Harvard, he talks about these problems as, he describes them as a perfectly purple problem, by which he means that some of them really are rooted in things that liberals like to talk about, things like the changes in technology and globalization that have caused decent-paying blue-collar jobs to flee from whole communities. And some of them are red diagnosis that have to do with family breakdown. And both of them are true. And in fact, a lot of people across the spectrum are going to have some contributions to make the discussion that restores social mobility, economic mobility for a large group of a class of Americans that where social mobility is stalled. And that should be a good conservative theme. We often have a very dysfunctional debate between liberty and equality, but we should be able to come to some agreement on mobility. And you talk about communication. I think that those are powerful themes. Americans will tolerate and have always tolerated high levels of economic inequality in an atmosphere where social mobility is possible. And in an atmosphere where social mobility is not possible, then economic inequality becomes a permanent caste system. And that is fundamentally at odds with the American ideal.
Just a quick second question from me that might put you on the spot a little bit.
Sure.
The faith-based initiative, the Bush administration, the premise is that the right kind of investments from the government can help civil society thrive. Some criticism emerged post hoc, as you know, that maybe that would make groups dependent on government and have the opposite effect. How do you think about that in retrospect?
Well, the Bush faith-based initiative was not an idea that was tried and found wanting. It was an idea that was tried, found difficult, and left untried for the most part. And one of the main problems with the legislative efforts that we attempted in the first term, in the first Bush term, was an almost complete lack of interest on the part of Republican leadership and the Republican Party itself when it came to changes in tax code or significant initiatives that were proposed. And so President Bush was left, as the current president understands to some extent, with a series of executive orders to try to encourage a level playing field for government contracting when it came to faith-based and community institutions. But many of the best policy ideas we had were trying to use vouchers and other methods to try to make people that were consuming social services be able to carry funds with them when they did these services. And there are, at least 3 layers here. One of them, the least problematic from the perspective you're talking about, the corruption of institutions themselves, is the use of the tax code to encourage charitable giving more broadly, which is a debate right now in Republican circles and with the president. But that has almost no problems with corrupting institutions. There is a settled set of laws that relate to these things. And that kind of middle ground there was vouchers and other ways to voucherize programs. And that, I think, is less problematic than other approaches. And then there were direct transfers to faith-based charities, which are done in New York and all sorts of other places. And that, as we're seeing, becomes a very complicated legal set of issues, not just from First Amendment grounds, because there actually are rules that relate to this and procedures and expectations, but in the application of civil rights law and a lot of other things by which religious institutions feel their autonomy to be attacked, violated, and undermined. So the short answer is there are a range of public policy alternatives that have a kind of range of effects when it comes to the autonomy of institutions themselves.
Questions? Yes, in the far back there, yeah. If you wouldn't mind telling us who you are and...
Brendan Riley. I work on data science research. I was curious when you had mentioned social inequality and the ability to move forward. Have the number of people being able to move forward dropped or increased in the past 10 years?
Well, we're getting a lot of recent data on this, and the president talked in his State of the Union address how social mobility is getting worse in America. The figures are kind of mixed, okay? But they're pretty bad comparatively. So levels of social mobility in the United States, movement between the quintiles, lower than Nordic countries, lower than France, lower than Canada. Some of that is because we've got a serious underclass problem. But as Putnam points out, the problem with the underclass problem is that it's metastasizing into a class problem and becoming much broader. You're reaching a circumstance where maybe a third of workers, the estimates vary, lack the most basic skills and social capital to compete in a modern economy, and that's a big deal. With long-term effects for the US economy, but also for a deeply divided society, class-based society. I guess my answer to that would be, I'm not necessarily convinced that social mobility is declining, but I think the stalled social mobility is affecting an unacceptably large portion of the U.S. public, and is having very real consequences. So.
Yes.
George Austin, retired from the investment management industry. Mm-hmm. In the context of your several references to social justice and common good, do you believe that the provision of health care is a right bestowed upon the individual by a third party, or is it the personal responsibility of the individual, in whichever way you come out, for what reasons?
It's a tough question. It's, not, it's obviously, I don't think it's a right in the same sense the legal right is a right. But we've had a shift in expectations confirmed by large legislative majorities over the last 60 years and more, that a certain minimal level of provision when it comes to health care is a social expectation. That is, I think that's consistent with the best instincts of the American character. But that doesn't mean that health insurance is a right, or that health care in certain forms is a right. It means right now, the way that that's expressed in our broader society, everyone has access to health care in America. And they have access through clinics and emergency rooms and other things that can't turn them away. So we've already made a social decision. That's the law. Then it becomes a question about how you organize that system in rational ways. If you look at most of the Republican alternatives that are emerging, and there are probably experts here that know more than I do about them, they move in the direction of establishing catastrophic health coverage as a social right and expectation. That's what conservative approaches have generally taken. So that's saying, we're given the sustainable system that we're going to have expectations about what coverage means in America that is realistic. But right now, you look at the Republican proposals, and I think they have moved very much in that direction. This debate has shifted. I think Republicans are going to need alternatives, not just to, they're going to have to repeal and replace. And that there are certain social expectations now that come with pre-existing conditions and other things that I think are going to be very hard to undo.
I have to get John Stosselen, the name of libertarianism was taken in vain a while ago, so I'd be remiss.
John Stossel, libertarian. Sure. Just two quickies. How does radical individualism, I would just call it individualism, threaten civil society? We join groups, the Manhattan Institute, or churches, or synagogue. We are, I thought, civil society. And secondly, what think tanks have lost good scholars because they embraced the Tea Party?
Well, I think the answer to the first one is the Heritage Foundation. And I think we're going to see that now. We'd also see it in the future. I used to work at Heritage and have great sympathy for many of the people who were there. But the atmosphere of that institution's changed significantly. And I think that we're both seeing and we'll see in the future that shift take place. In answer to your first question, I would argue that the most basic fundamental views that we hold about the world eventually affect our attitude, not just towards government, but to the institutions of our common life. So I was referring in the speech to the book that Yuval Levin recently did about Burke and Paine, talking about the distinction between their visions. Paine developed a view that was a radical individualism. He believed that individuals did not just need to be released or freed from governmental institutions, which he believed, but from social institutions that impose upon them unchosen commitments. That was one of the basic insights of the most radical of the American founders in Paine, the most radical of the English Whigs that were more favorable to the French Revolution, and to the French Revolution itself. And so, that is a thoroughgoing, ontological, radical individualism, a belief that individuals are not just freed from oppressive government structures or from monarchies, but in fact from the expectations of the past. Those are the 18th and 19th century roots of a lot of modern liberalism. And I think one of the things that distinguishes a kind of Burkean form of conservatism from some of these other options. That doesn't mean that everyone who holds these ideas is automatically not a joiner. But I think that the ideas of Ayn Rand and others, they certainly did have a certain set of attitudes and views towards religious institutions, and through essentially, and without getting into a lot of the discussion, but most of contract theories that locate individuals as societies as the result of individual choice, I think fall into this trap of radical individualism, and it does affect the way that we view the institutions of our society.
Just warning you, John has a forum where he could continue this conversation.
Right? Yeah.
On Fox. That's what I mean. Michael Myers.
Thank you. Michael Myers, New York Civil Rights Coalition. I wonder if you would further define your notion of conservative philanthropy through talking about a public-private partnership that has divided liberals and conservatives and united liberals and conservatives. And that is the president's My Brother's Keeper program, which singles out young men of color. Liberals and conservatives say that that is a discriminatory category, that it is a stereotypical category. Liberals and conservatives say, no, that's an affirmative action category and a do-good social justice effort on the part of government and private philanthropy. So I wonder if you might discuss the My Brother's Keepers program from the perspective of race and gender.
I believe the president also got major foundations to follow the government's lead in that program.
Well, I'm generally pretty favorable, and it is the type of issue that you can build unexpected coalitions. It's an area, speaking of rhetoric, where the president has been at his best in some forums, speaking of his own lack of a father, relating his public policy implications, the public policy implications of fatherlessness. So I guess my general reaction has been fairly positive, and it is the kind of thing where there is no law that's going to restore family commitments in that direct a way, although we can have a general atmosphere that values family and rewards it on our tax code. So I'm generally pretty positive about the president there. I guess my larger concern, and I don't want it to sound too harsh, is that the president almost never does creative policy outreach based on those kind of issues. It's just not been part of his repertoire. Bill Clinton did it much better than the current president, picking unexpected issues that had value implications. Whether obviously on welfare reform, where he was a more reluctant participant, but eventually took credit. But also school uniforms and crime and a lot of other issues where he engaged in that sort of outreach. My general feeling is that the president's policy staff has not done that very well. If you look at his most recent State of the Union, the only two promising ideas that I could see in the speech where he was talking about, praised some of Senator Rubio's possible changes in EITC, and then talked about a very marginal proposal to encourage savings and ownership. So I've just found him strangely unwilling to use one of the most important powers of his presidency, is the ability to use unexpected policy outreach to build cross-cutting coalitions. I'll give you one example. We did in the 2003 State of the Union address, we announced the president's AIDS initiative in that speech, $15 billion, 5-year program, to put millions of people on AIDS treatment. There were no demand for it in the Congress. Our main partners, immediate partners in that effort were John Kerry and Joe Biden. And the law passed from the president's announcement of the State of the Union address into law in 4 months. You can ideologically ambush the other side in a good way and build unexpected coalitions in our politics. It's possible to do that. I think No Child Left Behind did that. And I think that, I think the president has been strangely unwilling to engage in those kind of efforts.
We have time for one more, I think, and Ken Berger, hang on for the microphone. Hey, we're going to have two more. I'm going to get George Macdonald in here,
Yes.
too.
Ken Berger from Charity Navigator. There's an effort underway developing, it's been called the outcomes movement, the notion of measuring the performance of charities in a data-driven way to assess the performance of charities. And I'm wondering how you view it from the context of conservative philanthropy. You mentioned earlier William Chambra, who views this whole movement as antithetical to conservative philanthropy. I'm just wondering how you view it as to whether or not it might be even neutral or complementary towards other groups, or whether you think it is a problem.
Well, I've seen this a little bit from both sides. There is a model of philanthropy out there. I've gotten to know Bill Gates over the years, and he is a metrics guy, not particularly ideological, outcome-oriented. Tries to invest in high payoff, basic science, and that approach has real appeal in many ways. He's approached, by the way, it shows what happens when you apply those approaches in, say, educational reform, where some of his efforts to encourage teacher performance and measurement and testing have become deeply ideologically controversial with the education reform, with the education establishment. When he's not ideological at all, he's just pursuing how do you improve teaching. Okay? And so, measurement, outcomes can be revolutionary in and of themselves, apart from any ideological construct that's put around them. So I don't want to deny that that's real. But I focused in my speech on something that I thought was a current need in the conservative movement, when you're talking about conservative philanthropy, okay? And that really is the investment in this milieu, an intellectual milieu that provides an alternative governing vision, compelling vision of conservative social justice that can win majorities in the country and improve lives. That is a mix between outcome-based approaches and long-term strategic investment in ideas and scholars. And I think it's very hard to make some of those judgments about how you measure the impact of a great book, or it's just not going to be done with number of op-eds, number of conferences attended, number of speeches given. It's just literally not going to be able to do that. So those efforts really require long-term patient investment in idea generation and propagation. And I think that, if I were looking right now, I would think that that is an area where there's a significant need as well. So.
George Macdonald has been running one of the great charitable success stories of our times at the Doe Fund for many years. You may have read about him in the Wall Street Journal this past Saturday. George, do you still have a question? Okay. You have the microphone, I see. Okay.
I do, and it works. My wife Harriet and I won the Manhattan Institute Lifetime Achievement, William E. Simon Lifetime Achievement Award for Social Entrepreneurship. So we've been helping people at the bottom of our society when they're homeless and coming home from prison, and we use a unique method, work. And we pay them and do various activities, and we also generate revenue by doing that. For example, we work for business improvement districts that sweep the streets, and then they pay us, and we pay the gentlemen that do it, and after 9 to 12 months, they graduate and get private sector jobs. And we've done it literally now for tens of thousands of people since we started. And the power of our economic system, Ronald Reagan said it best, the best social program in America is a job. But here's the problem. It's that this is an idea that everybody in this room embraces. They see every day. They pat the people on the back. But we can't take it to any kind of scale without the government. Obama is a day late and $1 short. He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't have any concept of who he is as a human being, or else he would have attacked this problem the first day that he was in office. Because why do you run for office if you don't run to get the power to change the things that you think are wrong? But he didn't do that. My point is this, that we face the cliff where the idea is based, it really works, it benefits everybody, it saves the government money, it saves the taxpayer money, all of that, but it depends on some outside infusion of money beyond the revenue that we generate for the services that we provide. That can't come from the private sector. Arthur Brooks, AEI said it, that it can't come, there isn't enough money in the charitable sector for human services to do anything near the kind of scale that we need, in my opinion, to solve this problem.
As you may know, George ran for mayor of New York.
I ran as a Republican after 45 years as a Democrat, not on the social issues, but because I believed in the Republican economic policies. But I didn't get a hearing.
George, if I might, I think the great question at the heart of what you're saying is, do programs have to go to scale only through government, or is there another way to extend their reach?
Well, I would have voted for you. I think it's a fantastic message. But it is
What if they don't have a George Macdonald when they try to go to scale?
Well, this is.
How do we scale it? See, we need the government to scale it because the private sector, all of the money that we raise from the private sector is not enough to be able to accomplish what society needs to have.
Yeah. when I spent time on Capitol Hill looking at faith-based charitable efforts in particular, which is the area that I spent a lot of time on, can be, social science shows they can be extraordinarily successful. They can transform individual lives. They have fantastic anecdotal results, and their scale is often not sufficient, okay, to the challenges that are faced. This, to me, I didn't go into it, but is the real insight of subsidiarity, the idea of subsidiarity, which is a society should show deference to private institutions, but there is a duty to intervene when the scale and size of the scale of those efforts is not sufficient to the need. Okay, but still pursuing methods to promote their work rather than replace their role. Okay, this to me is what we tried to do when we talked about compassionate conservatism. It was a limited but active role for government in transferring resources and authority to institutions that can change people's lives. And that's businesses, and it's faith-based institutions, and it's community institutions. And this, I think, remains one of the great Republican contributions to these debates, but often doesn't get a hearing. And not just a hearing in the New York mayoral race, but often doesn't get a hearing in the Republican Party more broadly in America. And that, I think, is one of the challenges we need to address.
Please join me in thanking Michael Gerson.